Today, we are going to talk about a very interesting and very important subject in the current times of climate crisis and global pandemic. The planet is facing an unprecedented situation. On one hand, there is a looming threat of climate change, and on the other, there is a never ever seen pandemic. And in the middle of this, the climate change and sustainability targets are facing threat of being sidelined. So today we are going to discuss this pertinent issue, how nations and corporates can stick to their sustainability and ESG commitments, and what does it entail. So, kicking off this conversation, I would like to start with Mr. Christ. If he can talk us through about what these ESG commitments are, what does it entail for the countries, what does it mean for the countries across the globe, and why should it be the top agenda of all the countries across the globe? Mr. Christ.
Thanks, Shreya, and thanks for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. I think first, to get the basics down, ESG is an acronym that gets thrown around a lot. So it stands for environment, social, and governance. And the concept simply is that for policies, for projects, for companies to be truly sustainable over the long term, they can't do so with a single focus on something like financial returns. They need to do so with a view towards strong environmental stewardship and the development and growth of human capital, whether it's through the labor force or through their communities. So we have been looking at the role that ESG has in ensuring sustainability of our development work around the world, and the fact that the projects simply cannot truly have a long-term benefit in their communities and their countries without taking these things into consideration. I think this has been recognized through increasing investor attention to these issues. The Global Sustainability Investment Alliance has estimated that as of 2018, $31 trillion of investor capital has been designated to invest in assets which take ESG factors into consideration. That's up 30% from the same study that they had done 2 years ago. So the fact is, this is not simply a question of being a good corporate citizen or having a good PR campaign. It's about actually delivering results, not only for a financial bottom line, but also for positive environmental impact and social impact. And this has been backed up by many studies which show that companies that actually do integrate strong ESG principles into their full systems, the way they do their business, into their corporate DNA, actually deliver stronger results, whether it's a premium of anywhere from 1% to 4% in long-term return on equity. And so from the investor point of view, it's not simply a matter of appealing to their sense of maybe what is right for the long term, but also strong financial returns.
Right. I'd now like Mr. Munjal to explain us how corporates can actually adapt to sustainable businesses choices, and how can they make ESG a part of their normal business functions.
Yeah. So let me start with saying stakeholder capitalism is here to stay. Stakeholders are clients, employees, and society. Anybody who doesn't realize the importance of society in their business is probably in the long run not going to make as many returns as you would if you were to consider that. And this is why I say that. And especially if you're in India, you realize we always talk about age demographic advantage that we have. We're a young nation. A young nation means we have lots and lots of millennials. All studies for the past decade or so have shown millennials like to associate themselves with companies which have a higher impact. So by definition, if you have a higher impact, means you probably are doing well on the ESG rating. So companies who are doing well on the ESG rating are the companies which millennials are choosing. So in the long run, if you want to win in the game of business, you need to be one which is associated to ESG. So that is from a marketing point of view. And secondly, from a governance point of view, it's a no-brainer. If you do not have good governance, companies very often will not last the long run. Now the problem becomes how do you measure ESG? There are many different ways of measuring ESG. And as Lance said, ESG is becoming a very, very broad term. And there is, of course, some really good examples coming out of what happened very recently in the BLM, post the BLM uh, thing that we saw in the US. But we'll come to that a little later. But first, I have a question for you, Lance, as well. ESG standards, or let's just talk a little bit more about what is ESG. Europe has made it a standard, has given it a standard definition. The companies, the listed companies in Europe have started reporting. I know about 80 odd percent companies in the US have also started reporting about ESG. But the people still report it in their own format. So how do we standardize ESG going forward, or what is the outlook for a standard format for ESG, and how can all the companies adopt ESG?
No, that's a great question, Rahul. And I think you're right, because first, it is a broad bucket of issues. And I think we are seeing as we see greater awareness of it, we see companies and frankly, governments and regulators trying to struggle with how to have a strong set of standards. So at IFC, as you know, is one of our clients, we have performance standards that set out the principles by which the companies we invest in need to integrate assessments of environment, social review, transparency, and disclosure into their day-to-day. And we have our own approaches to that. But at the end of the day, I think as we see more and more of the investor communities moving to requiring this of their companies, we will see greater standardization. But I acknowledge it is a challenge at this point.
Right. Good that you mentioned about the challenges. Given that currently all these companies across the world are battling the epidemic and the financial slowdown that has come along with this, so do you think that this will impact sustainability and ESG commitments for most of these corporates, because they are anyway facing liquidity crunch, and in such a situation, usually such efforts and such targets take a back seat. So in a situation like this, what would you suggest to these companies?
So before Lance takes over the answer, let me lead him on to a little difficult, make it a little bit more difficult and more interesting. Let's break ESG into two. Of course, we are a renewable energy company, so sustainability and environment is very, very close to our heart. So the first part of that, Shreya, is I think when the lockdown happened, especially all my colleagues and friends and family and everybody else I know who live in India have got a taste of what a clean air or a starry night looks like. People who live by the rivers have seen that Ganga can be cleaned and Yamuna can be cleaned. So now we are tempted, we've got that taste of clean air in our mouths. So I guess from a public perception, we know how important the environment is and we know we want it clean. That's on the environment front. But also, if you see people are working from home, more people are riding bicycles. There are no new bicycle lanes coming up all over the world. So I think environmentally, in the short run, we've seen some very good benefits come out of this completely horrible experience of this pandemic. I'm not suggesting it's good by any way, mean or form, but all I'm saying is there has been some good to the environment that's happened through this. Now, that leads to your question, and I want to take it to Lance because I like it when he answers the hard and tough questions. So, Lance, I'm a complete believer that society and S in the ESG has become the forefront after this pandemic, especially because the biggest issue today is one of unemployment. After the tsunami of economic crisis, well, we'll see a tsunami of unemployment coming to us. So employment will become extremely crucial all over the world. And ESG, as we all agree, has a long-term impact on the companies, and the companies which have good ESG are, of course, in the long run, better run, and they do better. But in the short run, there is no. Could there be a disincentive to invest in ESG? I guess this is what Shreya was asking. And could it take a backseat while we know there is trillions of dollars which has been pumped into the economy? Uh, can we not ensure that this money gets used sustainably and with a heavy emphasis on ESG? And just to take that question a little forward, what are companies, what is the World Bank and what is IFC doing about it?
Thanks. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll start by making it even more difficult. And Shreya, if I can, I'd like to go back to how you opened up this session, and that is really framing it with both the overall climate challenge and the current situation we're facing with COVID. So, with the climate challenge, of course, we're facing the possibility that billions of people could actually move into poverty, that we could face severe risk to the security of our food and our water supply, that coastal populations will be devastated, and we'll see trillions of dollars worth of loss to consumption and assets. The World Bank estimates that if we haven't addressed this, that we'll see $520 billion a year in annually lost consumption, $300 billion a year in loss to economic assets. So the size of that, the magnitude of that challenge is enormous. 192 countries have signed up to the Paris Agreement, have put forth plans as to how they're going to address this. A critical part of that plan is, of course, renewable energy. So the area where Hero has been, quite a leader in India in terms of helping address the needs. At the same time, we're facing the fact that 1.1 billion people in the world still do not have access to electricity. So there's an incredible development challenge there, in addition to what you pointed out, which is the COVID situation. So we're seeing this year estimates that the global economy will contract 5%. That's obviously devastating in terms of the jobs that have been lost, the economic activity that has slowed down, and the impact of these lockdowns has been devastating. It's resulted in a decline 20 to 25% in energy demand in India during the lockdown. Now, I think the fact is that for us to address the long-term challenge of both addressing climate change as a need, but also creating access to energy for people who need it and to be truly integrated in the global economy, it's going to require about $8 trillion of investment in clean energy. So as I said earlier, the good news is that the investment community has recognized that ESG and the assessment of climate risk and the addressing of climate risk in business plans is a fundamental value and strength for companies that actually drives better return. So I think investors are going to reward companies and governments that actually take this head on in bringing new solutions and in sticking to the path that's needed ultimately to help us shift in our addressing of climate change and helping bridge these gaps in energy. At the same time, I do think there are immediate challenges. So with the drop in the economy, of course, we've seen a significant drop in oil and gas prices. This means that there is not as much incentive shift away from fossil fuels. We're not seeing as much availability of funds to go into the new research and development that's critical to find new technologies. And I think very severely, the impact on cities and municipalities is going to be extreme. And of course, they're bearing a huge brunt of the impact of COVID. And yet at the same time, as we see greater urbanization of populations around the world, it's really the cities that need to be the driving forces in some respects behind looking at energy solutions, clean transport, and helping bridge not only the development challenges, but also address the needs we have for climate. So there are near-term challenges, no question. But what we've seen is a number of studies coming out that show that companies that have adopted ESG standards have actually performed better than the overall market indices. So I think it simply reinforces the notion that investors will reward companies that need the capital and that seek the capital to adopt these kinds of strategies, undertaking the investment to meet these challenges.
That's a great point. Additionally, if you can both also address this major dilemma that a lot of corporate face, is that how can ESG add to monetary and financial value to these companies? This is a major query that a lot of companies raise when being talked into sustainability and ESG, etc. If you can address that as well.
I'll give it a shot from a corporate point of view first.
Sure.
I think ESG is where risk was a couple of decades back. When risk was starting out, when we were starting to measure how risky business is and what are the risks, then it became into a risk department, then it became a risk committee on the board, then it started being reported in board meetings, and there was a risk manager, and then so overall, then risk went from an idea in the 80s, and in the 90s, it became mainstream. And overall, the impact of having a risk officer or having a risk department in the company is a no-brainer. Now everybody says, "Oh, of course, we have to have it." And how could you ever think of a business without having a whole risk function in it? And just 20 years back, it was unheard of, or there were very few companies who were doing this. So I think ESG itself, according to me, will take a similar path. Today, you see a few companies reporting it globally, although the number is increasing at a fairly fast pace. But very quickly, you will see a place where companies start looking at ESG not only with the view of financial impact this year or next year, but with a shareholder value maximization or value creation over the life of the company. You see, there will be a very large difference. And I don't want to go into any negative examples here, but there are quite a few examples out there for companies who ESG rating was not rated or it went down. And 1 or 2 or 3 years into the company, you saw disasters in those companies. And these are some of the biggest names that we hear about. It could be in terms of, on privacy laws, because as a common man, if I'm dealing with an IT company, I don't know how good or bad privacy laws are. But if I pick up the ESG, it tells me if this is the company I need to deal with or not. So as a layman, it helps me decide which company is good, A, to invest in, B, to be a customer of. So ESG does that for me. So all I'm trying to say is, think of, especially the people who are listening to us, who are a part of the corporate world, think of ESG as a risk department, which will become an essential part of life, and the values and the benefit that you will gain from it will be far greater than just a dollar amount at the end of the year in the P&L. And with that, Lance, I would like to hear your views as well.
No, thanks, Rahul. I think you've captured from the corporate perspective both the why it makes sense and why it's the right thing to do. Again, I'll just try and add some numbers to it. We did a review recently of nearly 700 companies in our portfolio, and for those companies that had the highest environmental and social ratings in terms of risk factors and the addressing the risks, they had higher returns on equity by 210 basis points. So again, 2% increased return at a time when investors are doing everything they can to find better yield. That speaks volumes in terms of the value at the bottom line of adopting these. But I want to take it a little bit further because IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So our ideology very much is that it's the private sector that is really the engine behind growth and ultimately positive development around the world. But it has to be obviously in partnership with governments who set the rules, who frame the investment landscape. And if I look at the industry that Hero is very much involved in, if we look at renewables, which plays such a critical role in helping us address both energy access and climate, I think of two very different examples. Over a decade ago, Mexico took some big steps to open up and promote renewables in their sector. And it was done in a very sort of a Wild West sort of a way where there weren't a lot of rules in place for how companies would access land, how they would negotiate certain aspects. And you saw incredible differences and issues around how much people were paying and how much information was around there, which ultimately led to significant social opposition that created a major issue for developers moving forward. And the social license to operate was significantly undermined because of the absence of a good landscape, the absence of long-term planning. Fast forward nearly a decade, and we look at the Benban solar project in Egypt. This is the largest solar project in the world, 1.8 gigawatts of capacity. Egypt did a fabulous job in really looking in a long-range way at doing alternatives assessment to siting, baseline studies, and collectively then the many developers that are working jointly in that solar park are working through a facilities management company that's helping ensure a consistent approach to addressing important issues around impact on the environment, impact on biodiversity, impact on the community. As this industry seeks to penetrate more deeply into its countries, it's going to have to go into more frontier locations. It's going to have to go into more challenging areas. So these issues about biodiversity, the issues around community impacts become more challenging. And the government needs to play a critical role, because by the time an auction has happened, by the time a developer is looking to build, the amount of time left for doing the environmental studies, for sitting down with communities and thinking about, how can we best integrate this for the long-term benefit of the community, it's very difficult. So this needs to be thought of well in advance, and any one developer is quite constrained in how much they can do on their own. So government has to play a critical role in setting out long-range plans and clear baselines for how these issues get addressed.
Right. There's this new trend emerging about net zero. How can companies achieve this net zero? Do you think, how is it feasible? And also, given that it needs government support and funding support, how feasible this idea is, and how can companies look at it?
So let's talk about the importance of net zero, and let's just go all the way back to climate change. And go back to the Paris Accord that we spoke about a little while back. So, in order to restrict the climate change to 1.5 degrees, we have to make some drastic changes, and we have to make drastic changes in the decade that we live in. It has to be done before 2030, and as a globe, we need to be net zero by 2050. And these changes are going to be made by the government. They're going to be made by large corporates. They're going to be made by small corporates, and they're also going to be made by the citizens. And I'll start from bottom up now. As a citizen, we can start by reusing, recycling, and also consuming less. The first and foremost thing is, if we consume less, our carbon emission footprint is less. Then, as a government, you spoke about Paris Accord. Governments have given their countries have given their indices for carbon emissions. How much are they going to reduce? And although they are not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Now, for large corporates, ESG is a good tool to see what they're doing in sustainability, for environment. Are they a net polluter, or are they a net? Are they making the environment better or worse? Companies which have a net zero goal. Couple of years back, if you had a net zero goal, it was almost unthinkable. How could a company have a net zero goal if the company's business was to create something or to manufacture something? But today, the cost of sustainable technologies, and I can talk about renewable energy because we know the cost of solar, we know the cost of wind, the cost of energy itself has become so low that it makes economic sense to be very high on the sustainability index rather than low. So when a company says we will be net zero in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, they're doing two or three things here. One, they are ensuring if they cannot directly consume sustainable practices, they have the capacity to buy ESG or invest in ESG bonds or invest in other RECs where they can buy certificates, which allows them. But if they can't, they can have their own practices in the business, which allows them to be net zero. And zero carbon emissions are, like I explained, something that if we don't do it, Lance gave out the numbers earlier. Those numbers are just mind-boggling every time I hear them. The trillions of dollars increase, and I am scared if we are not able to meet this decade and the next decade, we will be in that position where the world will be spending that much money post facto rather than spending it now pre facto. Lance?
No, you said it well, Rahul. I don't need to add anything to that. That was terrific.
A lot of this ESG and sustainability initiatives that the companies take, it's mostly out of risk, environmental risk, climate change, or human rights for that matter. How do you make it more willingly? How can companies be more willing towards it? Would availability of finance from the government, availability of public finance is better, or just large targets are enough to push them? What do you think could push these companies into the right direction?
I'll give a very small example and I'll leave it for Lance to answer the more detailed answer. And it's something very interesting I read. One of the things ESG measures is diversity in a team. And it is a very well-known fact. If you have 5 people who look exactly like you and think like you and behave like you in a room, and you ask them to design something, versus another room where you have people completely from different walks of life, and you put 5 of them into a room and ask them to design something, the one with the different experiences will come out with a product which is probably more innovative, more impactful, and probably better in many, many ways. So diversity is extremely important. Now, diversity comes, and diversity is a score on ESG, right? So it is not because of something that the government is going to give us. It's something because I want to improve the performance of my team. I want to have a diverse team, and thereby diversity becomes important. So a lot of these benefits are inherent. They are not a carrot given by somebody else, but there is inherently what a company can achieve, how it can achieve more, how it can do better, just by following these practices.
Yeah, in fact, I think this was the same direction I was going to go with that, Rahul. I think first off, I don't think we can or should try to separate risk from value creation. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. But in this particular area, Rahul already mentioned the challenges of millennials and frankly youth. There's an exploding population of youth, huge unemployment, and so the need to train and employ and engage and finding new ways to engage these youth is critical for companies. I would add to that the gender factor. The fact is that we still need to go much farther in ensuring we're truly integrating women throughout the process and at all levels, not simply at the lower levels of the workforce, but at the highest levels of governance of the companies. And that's something that I think still needs a great deal of attention. This is important because the human capital factor is critical for the success of businesses. And so investing in training, working together both with governments and communities in identifying the needs, whether it's vocational training, whether it's primary school, higher level, and training, and education also often requires food security, water security. If you're having families spending enormous amounts of time having to address the sort of basic life needs that can't be met by the community, they're not having a chance to get educated. So addressing issues of the availability of clean water in a community. Companies can actually work and do tremendous things in that area that will actually help free up human capital that ultimately support the long-term viability of the business itself. So I think there is a lot of interdependency here that actually has the benefit, the opportunity to create a virtuous cycle.
So lads, let me just, I'm sure you know this, but Indian government introduced an extremely interesting tax a couple of years back, which they call a CSR cess. 2% of your profits you're supposed to take and invest in corporate social responsibility. And I can almost see a couple of years down the line, the CSR says is going to merge with ESG. So if companies now need to start thinking, if that 2% money is something that I already have to my kitty, can I make sure I spend that even more to further my cause of ESG in case it comes at a cost? And if it doesn't, all the better. But there could be a mixing of the two fields at some point, and I think it could be a very impactful situation that Indian companies will find themselves in. Back to you, Shrey.
Yeah, thanks. We have some now interesting questions from our viewers. I'll take them one by one. Uh, this one question is specific to the renewable energy sector. The person has asked that what is the future of this sector after experiencing such a bad pandemic? Policies are getting changed for which investors are losing interest. So, moreover, under the Atmanirbhar Bharat, what are the steps government is taking to boost up the manufacturing business? I think what they want to ask is basically the going forward, what would be the future of the renewable energy sector in India post COVID? Something that everyone wants to know right now, because this sector is one of the top agenda of the Indian government, but currently is facing a lot of issues from all the sides due to COVID. Mr. Munjal, if you would like to address that.
Yes, Shrey, thank you so much for that question and bringing the discussion to something that I'm super comfortable with. To begin with, COVID has done two things. COVID has accelerated the world's need to be nationalistic. Is it good or bad? I'm not here to judge. But the reality is, we see more and more nations becoming a little bit more socialistic, a little bit more nationalistic. So now, when they are becoming more and more nationalistic, especially when we saw when COVID hit in the early days, when everybody was running helter skelter for PPEs, for ventilators, everybody realized the importance of taking care of their own country first and then helping out with other countries. And this has activated the need for every country to look after themselves and their people. And fast forward till today, we have seen Indian government talk about more than once to create our own manufacturing base for solar. And the manufacturing base has increased over the last 3 years, but it's nowhere close to where it needs to go to. India has an ambition of doing anywhere between 10 to 15, maybe even close to 20 gigawatts of solar year on year, every year for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 10, 15 years. So if that is the kind of solar panels we will require, if that's the capacity we require, today our manufacturing base is a very small fraction of that, and the rest is all imported. So government is trying to come up with schemes, it is trying to come up with tenders, it is trying to come up with bids, which encourage manufactured, made in India solar panels. And but the sad part is it's not a switch. Even if you desire something today, by the time you have a factory up and running, by the time you have people, train them, machines, etc., it takes time. So 5 years from now, will our manufacturing base in solar be a lot more than it is today? Of course it will. Of course it will. But will it happen over the next 6 months? I don't think so. It's not something, sadly, it's not a switch that you can turn on and off. But that's the direction India is headed in. The manufacturing of solar will increase in India manyfold from where it is.
Right, thanks. Yeah, there's another question that they're asking that does ESG investment implies low returns? Sir Christ, would you like to address that?
Sure, and I'm sorry if this is going to sound like a broken record, but I think what we've seen from BlackRock is the largest individual asset manager in the world, $6.5 trillion of assets. Its CEO, Larry Fink, came out with an announcement in January that all of their investment would be ESG focused because they, as a nuts and bolts investor managing $6.5 trillion of endowments and pensions and institutional and retail investors, had determined that there was categorical evidence across the board that strong ESG focus led to superior risk-adjusted investment returns. So whether that's 1%, 4% over long term across broad indices, I think that's very positive. And again, taking the current situation into consideration, what we are seeing, admittedly, with sort of limited information over the first 4 months of the year, is that companies that had strong ESG factors in place actually have proven to be more resilient in managing, working with their supply chains, their value chains, their people, their communities, and as a result have had better returns over that period. So I think the evidence is there. I don't think this is something that's going to be reversed.
Right, right. The next question is
Shreya,
that,
Shreya, sorry, let
sorry,
me also there.
yeah,
You know,
definitely.
you know, and even after solar became the cheapest form of energy, for many years, people's perception still was, oh, is it a business where you get a lot of grants? Is it a business where you need government intervention? The reality is the business moves much faster than people's perception. People's perception takes forever to change. So the reality is ESG today does not come at a cost. ESG is just the right thing to do because even economically is the right thing to do. If forget more for moral reasons, but even for economic reasons, ESG investments are the right investments to make. But it's the perception that is taking much longer to change than the reality. And Larry Fink's note was just that. He spoke about this is exactly what he spoke about, and $6.5 trillion. There you go. 3 times the size of India GDP.
Can I also throw something out there? And I apologize if this seems to digress a little bit from the core topic of ESG, but clearly in today's world with COVID having wreaked so much havoc on the global economy, it makes sense to focus on some of those challenges. But I think as well, there's a lot of excitement and opportunity that we have ahead. And again, if I think about this industry where people are raising questions about the future of renewables, as Rahul just mentioned, the cost structure in solar has come down 85% over these years. Cost in wind has come down over 60%. So there have been tremendous advances. These industries do not rely on subsidies and grants. And yet we're seeing new technological developments, new business models that are now being able to get into storage, that are getting into electric vehicles, e-logistics. So I think in the next decade, we're going to see absolutely tremendous changes where our energy systems and our transportation systems and the way our cities operate are all going to be converging. And I think the way we're going to be looking at business a decade from now is going to be completely different from the way we're looking at it, today. And I think the opportunity for investors, for people, for learning new skills, creating new jobs, I think that's just an incredibly exciting trend that we're going to be able to all participate in and watch over this next decade.
Yeah.
Right.
Shreya, if I was just shed some more light on what Lance is saying, and this is another topic that's really
Sure.
close to me. It's about it's called futurism, I guess. What does the future look like? And I'm not talking about a future which is 20 years away, but a future that's 2030. And we know for climate change, we have to change our habits completely before 2030 happens. So this is what my personal take is. I see, of course, renewables becoming mainstream. I see battery storage coming in a big way in two folds. One is in cars itself. So cars becoming virtual power plants. So you see a very large number of cars. So that means our grid becoming a smart grid, changing to a smart grid. Homes turning into smart homes, conserving energy when they have to, producing energy when they have to. And all these technologies are there and they're all being used, but one doesn't realize the scale they are being used at and how suddenly one day our life will change, look completely different from today. And that day is not very far away. So it depends on where you live and what industry you're in and how close you are to this. Suddenly the way things look and feel within 1 decade, and 10 years is not that much, will be completely different. And personally, I'm actually a climate optimist rather than a climate pessimist. So I think most of these things will happen and will happen on time.
True. The next question is that what are the minimal ESG commitments any large organization should have to ensure that it is moving in the right direction?
Before Lance answers, I want to just say one thing out there. And please correct me if I'm wrong. After the BLM riots recently, I read somewhere Bank of America has said $1 billion for businesses which support BLM. So if you see these fairly large ticket items, and these are all ESG in one form or the other. So that's something that I read recently, and I just thought I'll leave it out there.
Yeah, I think I would say that there's an old management maxim that says you get what you measure. And I think a first step for companies that have not really developed much in this area is to understand where they are today in their operations. So assess and measure their environmental performance, their degree of social engagement, whether it's with their own workforce and the communities, and through measurement and review of where they are today, and compare and benchmark against other companies in their industries and around the world, they'll see where the gaps are and where they have both low-hanging fruit, things that can be done relatively easily and quickly to generate very quick returns and lower the risk, and also longer-term goals that they can strive for.
Right. There's another question which is asking that corporates now are looking at purpose as the core of their business. So, for an organization like yours, I guess they mean Hero Future Energies, sustainability initiatives is the key. But what are the challenges faced in communicating this with the larger stakeholders?
Mm. You see, great question. The challenges are different when it comes to different people. Um, like I said, with the millennials, there are no challenges. They understand it and they get it like this. And they know the importance, they know the need, and they understand what we're trying to do. So businesses like ours are called impact businesses. At the end of the day, we are businesses. We are not a charity. We're not an NGO. We are here to make money, but at the same time, make an impact, make a positive impact to the world we live in. So I'd like to think about impact investing as the main form of investing going forward. Again, going back to the millennials story, because you'll see more and more millennials become entrepreneurs. So impact investment will automatically become, is actually already become the need of the hour. What is important for us is, when you are trying to when you're trying to do renewable energy, the sad part is we are trying to disrupt other business models, and the business models have invested money over many many years. There's a lot of jobs that depend on it. There's a lot of it could be free for low cost of energy that comes from it, or subsidized cost which has been subsidized over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So when we are trying to take over their market share, we need government intervention to support them so they can back off and they can encourage new players like us. Because we don't want to increase our market share at the cost of another business. That's really not our job. But it's for the governments to understand how do you transition the energy from one source of energy to another without harming existing businesses, or at least letting existing businesses run till their life of business. So if a thermal plant needs to run for 40 years or 25 years or 30 years, you let it run for those many years and then you shut it. So how do you do that transition becomes key. And this is what is, I guess, the biggest challenge that renewable faces globally right now. How do you transact, or how do you transition into clean energy while ensuring that you are not disrupting what was already there? Because there are livelihoods that matter, and there are people who work very hard to create what they had created.
Right. There's one question for you, Chris. It says that IFC has been involved in funding many initiatives which have grassroots impact, like projects in developing states such as Bihar. What are the challenges that you face?
Well, I think one of the one of the challenges is when it comes to engaging with communities. The best time to have done it was yesterday or 10 years ago, really. These are not things that can be done at the flick of a switch. As I was saying earlier, they really require long-range planning and a concerted and holistic approach between both government and the private sector, and understanding where the sensitivities are, what the risks are, whether it's again to biodiversity and the possible impacts there, whether it's to resettlement of communities, or the need to, again, ensure proper management of resources, water access, and the like. These are challenging issues that really don't have quick and easy solutions, but ultimately need to be addressed through broad stakeholder engagement, through government, the communities, and the private sector, and really thinking through what strategically are going to be the best decisions from an alternatives perspective, looking at baseline studies that have to have been done very early on.
Right. We'll take our last question now, and it's a
Shreya,
very interesting.
yeah, I have a question for you before you go to the last question. You've been writing about renewables for a long time, and you know about India. What do you think, in your opinion, what should the government do to improve ESG sustainability and ESG, and what should the journalists do to focus more on ESG and sustainability?
Regarding government, I think a more localized approach should help. It's good to have grand targets. It sets the stage for more investors' interest in that, more companies' interest, and it catches public glare. You would understand the same that happened with renewable energy targets, and how we are going ahead with solar and wind as well. But I think a more localized approach helps. That way, you sensitize citizens more, probably focusing more towards decentralized solar or energy efficiency solutions. Like a simple LED program led to such a big change in the mindset of people. So same for sustainability and such governance issues, environment and social sensitization should happen at a localized level, so that not only just big or mid-sized companies, but also smaller companies also participate in that, and also citizens are also more mindful about their choices. Because I guess we are at this point in our life where we have to make this conscious choice, keeping climate change in mind, but that needs to percolate at every possible level. Second, you asked about how journalists can more cover it. I think it comes with the mindset. Even if you're writing about any sector, or any companies, not just writing about the energy sector, you keep that in mind. You have to pose questions to companies and policymakers, keeping environmental consciousness and issues around climate change in mind. I think when a dialogue starts in that particular direction, it leads to a positive change, is what I believe.
Excellent. I hope you write a lot more articles on climate change and ESG from here on.
Thank you. I'll try my best. And this is a very interesting question. This person has asked that how can a regular citizen find out that an organization is committing to a sustainable future, and how they make an informed decision on what kind of organization they should transact
Lance, you want to start?
Sure. Well, again, we've been talking about ESG. The G, governance, corporate governance, encapsulates a wide range of things, but critical within that is transparency and disclosure. So I would say the first is with the abundance of access to information over the internet. Companies that are really looking to project in this area will obviously be providing information publicly about their impacts and the values that they have. In addition, on a more nuts and bolts level, typically when commencing projects of one sort or another, there are public notice periods and consultation periods. One can look through the announcements for those to engage in consultation processes and town hall areas, things like that. But ultimately, it is, again, just going through understanding whether the companies are walking the talk through the disclosures they make about the kinds of policies that they have, and then checking up on that, looking at referrals, talking to others who they've worked with. I mean, these are very basic sort of mechanics.
Yeah, so I want to add a few things to that. when you start by looking at companies and you start researching them on the net, the first thing you realize is that there are a lot of companies out there who are greenwashing. They're not necessarily uh, doing what they're supposed to, but they are obviously marketing themselves really well. So one needs to go and peel the layers and go dig a little deeper. But two, three good ways of doing it. Of course, all public companies in Europe have to have an ESG report. A lot of the companies in the US have an ESG report. I would imagine this would become a norm in India sooner than later. Other than that, if you see a company where BlackRock is invested, or some of the Nordic investors are investing, or of course IFC is invested, you are, at least you know that they've done their homework to invest in that company, because they've passed the muster. So one is to see who are the investors behind it. The second is to see, if those companies have an ESG report, nothing like it. That's the best case. But if not, one should be aware that greenwashing is also very prevalent in today's day and age.
Right. There's one last question which we'll take and then conclude. It's for you, Rahul. It says that can renewable energy as an industry thrive in India when it depends almost entirely on the extremely shaky edifice of state government distribution and transmission arms, which are perennially financially challenged? I cannot agree more, but I would like you to address that.
You know, I said in the beginning, I'm a climate optimist, but I'm an optimist nonetheless. Um, I do believe there are some challenges in the Indian electricity domain, especially because it's a concurrent subject. It's a subject that center deals with as well as the state deals with. But if you see some of the changes proposed in the new electricity law or in the tariff policy, there's some very, very wonderful things which are happening. So I agree, major changes have to happen for the long run. The way is going now, we will face many, many challenges going forward until unless these changes, which are proposed already, are not implemented. But I am bullish. I think they will be implemented sooner than later, and I feel we will very quickly see. It's not very easy to. I mean, it's very easy to take care of the problems in the industry where you have a monopoly. You buy at a certain price, you need to sell at a price which is a little higher than your buying price, and you make money. So fundamentally, there is no reason for these companies to do really well, or even they do well enough to support themselves. So as far as fundamentals go, if you believe in India, if you feel India has the potential of making changes and making sure, we have moved from 80 odd place in ease of doing business to 50. So having said that, there are a lot of good things which are happening, positive policy changes. So I think there is some short-term pain, but not to say that long-term. Once these are dealt with, I think you will see a electricity industry which is uh, second to none in the world.
If I
Thanks,
can, I
Rahul.
know we're running out of time, but if I can just add to that,
Sure, sure.
Rahul said he's an optimist. I think I'm an optimist as well. And we financed 17 gigawatts of renewable energy in 89 countries. So, no two countries are the same. And the reality is, this is still a relatively new industry. It represents about 5% of the total energy matrix globally today. That number's got to get up to past 20, 25% for us to reach our long-term climate goals. So while we've come tremendous distance in terms of reducing costs, mainstreaming the technology, getting into auctions that have that have created access, we're still maturing. It is still maturing as a business. And I think as we see best practices around the world, countries will take those policies on board and harmonize more and more and capture that in terms of developing and creating access in the future. So I do think we see a lot more of that ahead of us.
Right, let's hope so, and let's hope that the sector grows leaps and bounds along with policy support and a lot of companies entering into it. And I really hope that the policymakers and the corporates across India and across globe take up sustainability more seriously, are more mindful of their choices, which by keeping environment and climate change in mind. And thank you, both of you, for this very interesting conversation. I'm sure, like me, Everyone had a lot to learn from this, and I would like to thank our viewers who had sent such amazing questions. It was a very lively interaction. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.